Hi, welcome to the Personality Hacker Podcast. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge. And we want to introduce you to the first in a series of podcasts on personality typologies. Personality typologies are our bread and butter at Personality Hacker, and it dawned on us about, what are we, almost 20 podcasts in, that we haven't actually talked about personality types at all.
Our name is Personality Hacker, and yeah, this is, it's about time, I guess.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the reasons why we've talked about other maps and models instead and you know, discussed other subjects is that personality types are something that you kind of have to ease into. You wouldn't think that. You would think that everybody would be interested in personality types, but the truth is that it's a field that is often abused. We have noticed that people can get really turned off by the concept of personality types and personality psychology.
Well, I think also, when I started learning some of this stuff early on, I used it as kind of a weapon to like, aha, you're this type, and that's why. And sometimes I still find myself doing this. You're this type, and that's why you're behaving that way, and you're all wrong because. And it's like, no, that's not a good way to use a typology system as a weapon or to broad brush things. And I think that's something that people are like turned off by.
Mm-hmm. Well, and also I think that we are very skittish about believing there's a tool out there that can encapsulate the entirety of who we are as an individual into, say, one little group of letters or one number. Yeah. You know, like, or a couple different, you know, characteristics that we have. And when people study typologies, or when somebody else studies typologies and they try to introduce us to what our type is, I think that's the first, you know, knee-jerk reaction we get is it's like, well, you're going to tell me that you know everything about me and, you know, based on this other model.
Yeah.
So typologies are something that need to be, I think, respected when somebody starts to enter the world of personality psychology.
Yeah. I think also, I personally, and I think you agree with me, it is true that you can't reduce somebody down to a set of letters or numbers. And if anyone thinks that that's what we're doing with personality typology, that's not. It's actually things that will help us identify the more unique qualities of people by getting kind of the things that are similar out of the way first. In other words, it's, you know what I mean? Like it's finding categorical things that we can agree upon. Oh, you're this type of person. And then the nuances and the individuality of you as a person actually can come through even more because of the frameworks and the models we use in typology.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Well, and in fact, I wrote a report about this. It's at, you know, personalityhacker.com if you sign up for our newsletter or for our weekly email. There's a portion in that report where I talk about using type, like what is the point of personality types? Mm-hmm. And it really comes down to the fact that there are 7 billion people, well, almost, right? Have we hit 7 billion yet?
It might be 9 billion, but...
No, it's not 9 billion.
Who knows? I mean, probably 20 billion at this point. Who knows?
300 billion by this point.
Well, it depends on when they're listening to this podcast.
Who could ever possibly know that number? I'm pretty sure we're
No,
almost...
I think it is around 7 billion, actually.
Yeah, I'm not sure if we've quite hit it yet. I can't remember.
Give or take a few people.
Yeah. And the truth is that every single person is completely unique. To learn about each individual human being in their entirety, if we were going to do that, that would be an unrealistic task given that we have about 80 to 90 years on this planet.
Yeah.
However, we all do share common characteristics. There are components to us that, and we know that because we'll run into somebody and we're like, oh my gosh, it's like we share a brain, right? And we don't know why that person is so similar to us or so familiar. And yet we just know that for some, you know, somehow this completely unique human being that we've run into, there are so many things about them that mirror our experience or mirror how we think. And that's because there are commonalities. In fact, there's limited ways to see reality. There's limited ways, well, not to see reality, but there's limited ways of interacting with reality. And there's patterns to it. We see this when people, you know, start writing fiction and they study archetypes. They study fictional archetypes, and there's a limited set of archetypes. There's the reluctant hero type, and, you know, there's the hometown, well, they call it in copy, the hometown boy makes good. There's all these sort of archetypes in fiction. And one of the things that writers do is they study those archetypes and discover ways to weave those common themes into their fiction. And the reason why they do that is because we will, as readers, see those things and they'll be familiar to us. They'll have this ring of truth, this resonance.
Yeah.
And that's a big part of what a good typology system will do. A good typology system doesn't presume to define a person in their entirety. A good typology system sees the patterns of archetypes and then helps us kind of figure out which archetype we're more like than other archetypes.
Yeah. As you're talking, I'm thinking this is one of the reasons why we don't use just one typology system at Personality Hacker. We use a bunch and we interweave them and overlay them to get a more granular, more accurate picture. And even that still doesn't come close to getting down to the heart of the individual person. So kind of with all that caveat out of the way, as far as like, you're never going to be able to understand someone completely fully at their unique person. Everyone is unique. Everyone is individual. It's impossible to have a type. I mean, there are basically then 7 billion types of people on the planet, if you think about it. But there are patterns. And today, what I thought we could talk about, you and I have talked about this before, we could go through some of the ways that we look at the personality models we use from a meta perspective, the frameworks we hang all of our individual models that we use. And then over the next couple of weeks, we'll go through some of those individual models one at a time specifically.
Yeah.
So I thought we could start, there. And,
absolutely. Well, before we do that, though, I just want to make a quick note on why we feel like these typology systems, now that we've just said, oh, they're incomplete, oh, they can never define a person completely, then what's the point, right? Like, if they're not meant to tell you who you are, then what advantage do they have? Why are they useful for us? And I think one of the most important components is that we as people are always looking for feedback that we're okay. Like we're okay. There's nothing intrinsically broken about us.
Yeah.
That just because we're different than other people, that we're still not bad people for that. We're just fine. We're okay. And we're constantly looking for that feedback because I think there's something inside of us that fears that we're not okay. Yeah. That we fear we are broken. One of the reasons for that is if we come at the world with a slightly different take or a different evaluation system or a different learning process or a different strategy than maybe the people who are influencers in our lives, like maybe our parents or our teachers or somebody who, maybe an adult that had a mentor that had a massive influence in our life, and they come at the world with different preferences than we do, they can either consciously give us the message that we're broken or wrong or there's something about us that's not okay, or we can unconsciously pick that message up because we are so different from them. And when we understand that there are different preferences using different typology systems, different ways of learning, different ways of evaluating, different ways of, different strategies for entering the world, then suddenly we realize that it's not personal. Like, it's not about me and it's not about this person who is influential in my life. It's about the system, right? Like, we just have different preferences and that's just how we're wired.
We just see the world differently.
We just do. And it has nothing to do with whether or not we're okay. And because it impersonalizes the friction we get from difference, right? Suddenly it's not about like, I'm different from you, so therefore I'm bad or you're bad. When we recognize that there's patterns to this and there's just different ways, we just have different wiring and that's just built in, that's hardwired and we can't really do anything about that, and neither could they. Then suddenly it's not about, good, bad, wrong, evil, whatever. Now suddenly it's about, the system.
Yeah.
And it gives us a profound sense of I'm okay. Like, I'm going to be just fine. What it really gives is permission.
And acceptance.
Yeah, self-acceptance.
I think both those things, for me, especially knowing this, has really helped for me to see that, there's nothing wrong with this weird way I see the world. Like, it's not weird, it's me, and there are other people like me. And finding a tribe of people that are similar has been huge, and understanding personality psychology and personality typology and all of these different things has really personally impacted my life. And I'm sure if you're listening and you've dabbled with some of this as well, you've probably seen aha moments in your life for you and those around you. Oh, I see why my spouse does this, or oh, I see why my brother did this growing up, and now I see why I react this way. And it's very enlightening and it's useful. And as we develop in Personality Hacker, we're learning and we're growing and we're developing content around how to take these models and use them for development, to develop yourself, which actually leads me to the first kind of meta model framework that I'd like to talk about real quick, that we hang personality and all these different models upon. And that's the difference between a horizontal model and a vertical model. And this is kind of a meta frame to hang some of these on. A horizontal model, if you picture, a horizontal line, it'd be like assuming everyone is at the same level of development horizontally. So we're all, like for example, you and I are humans. So we're on the same horizontal development. I'm not a sheep and you're not a human. We're not different hierarchically. We're the same horizontally, but there are differences between us, lateral movement wise. You're a female, I'm a male, but we're both human. We're on the same plane, but we have differences on that same plane. Whereas a vertical model doesn't necessarily assume that everyone's at the same level of development. In fact, there are levels of development. So picture a vertical line or stair steps, like vertical stair steps. There are levels of movement upward in developing, in evolution, in movement forward, in progress. And so, for example, when you're a child learning a new skill, let's say the English language, if you're here in the United States, you are a certain developmental level of learning a language, whereas I, as an adult, might be above you in that developmental model. Mm-hmm. So this is kind of a way that we see different typology systems, is the vertical versus the horizontal. A lot of the typology systems that we talk about, their identification is identifying things on a horizontal plane. So not my personality is no better than your personality in certain typologies, in all typologies really. We're just different. We have different ways of seeing the world. Now, I might have grown as a person. I might have expanded my consciousness to understand a bigger picture and systems thinking and things of this. So I might have developed on a vertical model more than somebody else, or they might be above me. And there's going to be this hierarchy structure going up and down in how we develop as people. So that's kind of the difference between horizontal versus vertical. And this is one of the meta frames that we're hanging a lot of these maps and models upon.
Yeah, and what's really great about understanding the difference between these two styles of typologies is that it helps create a really great what I call the "you are here" dot. Yeah. It kind of puts it on a graph. It's like you've got the y-axis and the x-axis, and you can kind of see, okay, so I'm this preference for, my personality type of, like this is sort of how I learn and this is how I evaluate and these are my strategies. And that's not any better or worse than anybody else. We just have kind of different preferences. And I'm more like this type over here, right? So like, oh, you're a different type than me, but we're really similar in these ways. And I'm really different than this type over here. But, none of us are necessarily better or excuse me, none of them are better or worse, like you said, but I might be at a different level of development. And I want to know that too. I want to know what my preferences are. And I also want to know where I'm at in the stream of my personal development, my growth.
Yeah.
So having a combination of both styles of models are really important. And I think that's one of the limitations when somebody chooses just one typology to overfocus on. In particular, if it's a horizontal model, right? A horizontal typology where they just focus on how we're different and the same. I think the mistake that people make is that they suddenly see that as a vertical model too, right? Like if I'm this personality type, that makes me better than this other personality type that I'm very different than.
Yeah.
And there's nothing vertical woven into many of these typologies. Right? They're totally horizontal. They have nothing to do with better or worse. They have nothing to do with development.
I also see like a good metaphor for this would be the difference between someone who plays golf, a golf player, and someone who's an archer who shoots bows and arrows, archery. They're both sports people, like sportsmen or sportswomen, right? But they can, so that's their definition is they're sports people. And one is an archer and one is a golfer. But then they can excel in their individual expression of that sport. An archer can become better and better and better at being an archer. Does that mean he's a better golfer than the golfer? No. But the golfer can also become better and better at being a golfer. And they're individual sports that they can continually improve upon, defined as who they are. Does that make sense?
Oh, totally. Yeah. I think it's brilliant that you used archery and golf, two sports that people don't necessarily think of as better or worse than any other sport, as opposed to, say, football.
I did that on purpose.
Yeah, and hockey, which football players and hockey players will argue forever about which one's better or worse. So that was brilliant. That's a brilliant analogy.
Thank you.
One of the real advantages to horizontal models is it goes back to that whole concept of me wanting to think that I'm okay. When you understand where you fall in a horizontal model and recognize that there's just intrinsic differences that you have between yourself and other people, the first thing that happens is you give yourself permission to be yourself, which is amazing. The second thing that should happen, right, if you truly are giving yourself permission to be yourself, is that you unconsciously give everybody else permission to be themselves as well, right? Because if you love yourself, if you're settled, if you're resting into who you are, there's no reason to ever think critically about other people doing the exact same thing, right? You're like, oh yeah, this is such a great feeling. I want everybody to experience this. So one of the benefits of a horizontal, like a really good, solid horizontal typology, is that it gives you permission to be yourself. And then it has you giving everybody else permission to be themselves as well. So when we see differences, we don't automatically assume that person's bad, worse, better, or whatever. So that's the really brilliant thing about a good, solid horizontal model. And I'm going to use this as a litmus test for everyone, or feel free to use this, the listener. Feel free to use this as a litmus test. If the horizontal model that you're using does not help you do that, it is a bad model. Or you're misusing it. If you are using a typology and it is not allowing you to give yourself permission to be yourself, and it is not helping you give that same permission to everybody else, it's either a bad model or you're misusing it, right? To weaponize a model, which is very, very, very tempting, is a misuse of that model. And we call models tools a lot, right? And I like to think of the tools of models as kind of like a hammer. A hammer can be used to either build a building, or it can be used to bludgeon somebody to death over the head. And typology should never be used as a weapon. It should never be used to bludgeon somebody over the head with. And a really easy example of this is a married couple when they find out their personality type in whatever typology system you want to name. If they are in an argument and one of them goes, well, you're just a blah, 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 and that's why you're doing this, and that's wrong or bad, then you're weaponizing it. If you're using it to accuse another person of something wrong or bad because of their type, then that's officially weaponizing it. It should never be used as a weapon. And if you're using it as a weapon, then maybe it's best that you don't use typologies at all.
Yeah. I think I actually completely agree. The other thing about, and this kind of segues in the next kind of part about what meta models we talk about, is...
Oh, I just had one more thing to say
about
vertical models.
You're waving your hand
sorry.
like, wait, let me talk.
Yeah,
No, please go ahead. No.
I didn't want you to graduate.
Well, I'm not
yet.
graduating yet. I was still talking about horizontal. But please say what you want to say about vertical.
Well, I was just going to say, and the great thing about vertical models, horizontal models are great for permission. Vertical models are great for achievement, right? When you don't want to get into a place of, like none of us want to be static. None of us want to. Well, I mean, some people are perfectly happy being static, and that's totally fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are many of us who are into personal development anyway. Very much want to get to the next level of their growth. And vertical models are fantastic for helping us chart a path. Because a vertical model will tell you where you're at in your growth, and it will describe what the next level looks like.
Yeah.
It will tell you where you've come from. You can see all that great, the journey behind you. You can celebrate the fact that you've gotten to where you're at, and then you can have it describe what the next level looks like and the next.
Well, I think, and going back to the golfer and archer example, one of the mistakes you can make is, as you're progressing, you're a unique person. You've identified yourself along that horizontal model. Okay, I'm a golfer. And then you look over to your side and you see the archer maybe progressing further than you or not as far as you, and saying, aha, see, I see where you're at in your level of development. But they're not the same type. Like, they're not you. You're progressing forward. And so I think as you're moving, that achievement is really clear to see. You're going upward, and it's more about how you can grow as yourself, and blending these two together to see how they cross. Like we talked about, you can say, okay, as a golfer, I see what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to lower my score in my golf game. I'm not trying to hit a target with an arrow more. That's a totally different game. I'm not playing that game. This is the progression I'm going down. identified as this.
Totally.
And so I think blending these two, and I think I'm glad you once said that about the vertical model, because it is about achievement. It's about seeing where I'm going in my life. And there's all sorts of ways to grow using a horizontal model identification and then moving forward using that in achievement.
Yeah.
And we're developing a lot of those here at Personality Hacker as well. Okay, so
I just was like, no, I want to
no,
talk
I'm
about
glad you did, because I totally I'm glad you said that. The horizontal models and vertical models are usually measuring different things. That's, I guess, is what I was just going to say.
Yeah.
And that's something we probably can unpack and talk about for a couple minutes here, just to kind of get a sense. I mean, some personality typology models are going to measure your mind and how you learn to make decisions. Some are going to measure your emotions and how you're bringing up emotions. Some are going to measure the past. Some are going to measure the present. Some are going to measure there's all sorts of different models that are going to measure different things and look at you in a different way to get a complete picture of who you are as a person. So I thought maybe we could just talk and unpack that a little bit.
Of course, yeah. Basically, that's the second component that we wanted to establish in this particular podcast when talking about typologies, is that different typologies measure different things. Regardless of whether or not they're horizontal or vertical, they're going to look at your personality, the different facets of it, coming from slightly different angle. We'll be talking about Myers-Briggs. Myers-Briggs, it's basically the point of Myers-Briggs is to figure out how your mind is learning new information and how it is evaluating that information and making decisions. Now, not everybody sees Myers-Briggs that way. We're going to really go into that actually in a future podcast, probably the next podcast. We'll talk about Myers-Briggs and sort of our take on how to best use that model. But that said, that's very different than, say, the Enneagram, which is going to be another future podcast. The Enneagram is a typology system that studies the strategies we use to deal with trauma. Those are very different things. Strategies we use to deal with trauma versus how our brains are hardwired to take in new information and to make decisions. One is very neutral, and the other one is very charged. And yet both of them flesh out our personality type so that we really understand where we're coming from. And there's different vertical models. We'll be talking about what's called the Graves model in a future podcast. The Graves model is it's a study of both ourselves on a micro level and on a macro level, meaning we can study ourselves as individuals and we can study whole societies and understand how we as individuals evolve and how entire societies evolve, mirroring our individual experience and vice versa. And so that's measuring something completely different. That's about our level of awareness and our level of consciousness and our ability to take in, more what's called mimetic territory. Totally different than our strategy for dealing with trauma and, how we learn and evaluate information. So all of these kind of take in a slightly different take, right? Like they have just a slightly different way of looking at the same personality. And the more typology systems you use, the more fleshed out you're going to be. The more you're going to see different components of a person's personality. Again, these don't sum up a person, right? We all have different virtues, vices. We all have different characteristics. We have different influencers in our life. We all grew up just slightly different. Yeah. I always say this when I'm profiling a person. Profiling is when I actively ask questions and find out, to try to figure out how somebody's mind works and determine what their personality type is using a variety of models. One of the things I say is, no two people are exactly the same. Even if you cloned a person, the second the clone experienced different things in the world, they would be a different person, right? We are fashioned after our experiences, and there is no real typology system that goes through and tells you who you are based on your, all of the sum total of your individual experiences. Yeah. That's a part of who you are uniquely. So no typology system is ever going to be complete. No, none of them are. But the more you add to the picture, the more a complete picture you can get. You're never going to be fully complete. It's not, it's not exhaustive. Yeah. But it is going to be a more fleshed out perspective. And as we mentioned, the point of all these typologies is to understand ourselves better and give ourselves more permission to be ourselves. Yeah. If the typology system is not helping you rest into who you are, if it's not helping you understand who you are better, if it's not helping you give yourself more permission, then it is either a bad typology system or you are misusing it.
Yeah. I give a quick anecdote here, and this is going to make sense in a minute, but we were in Florida a couple months ago. I took my grandmother to the hospital. She was having some complications with her breathing. And in the midst of this, I realized that she has multiple doctors in her life, right? She's got a heart doctor who couldn't come visit her in this one hospital, so a secondary heart doctor had to come in. But then she's got her general practitioner. She's also got a doctor that helps her with her respiratory system. She's got different doctors, and each doctor doesn't really talk to the other doctors much. And a whole world of like insight into the health industry and how we treat elderly people like came to my mind, and how, and then she's got a pharmacist who's helping her with her medication that all these other doctors are prescribing. And he's trying to like organize it and make sure she doesn't overdose. And it came clear to me when I look at this as a metaphor for typology, it became clear to me that my grandmother's, either her or the loved ones in her life, like myself, need to be responsible for her own health, because not one doctor, her heart doctor, specializes in hearts and her vascular system. He doesn't mess with her, nervous system. He doesn't mess with her respiratory system. He doesn't mess with anything else. And he's not necessarily taking into account all this. Now, her general practitioner should probably be doing all this. But it really became clear to me that she's responsible. She and the people in her life are responsible for her health, to take all these different doctors and all these different systems in her body and overlay them and understand what's happening on a fundamental level. And it became clear to me that that is the same thing with personality typology and understanding yourself. You are the one that needs to, that's why it's so powerful. You're the one that needs to understand all these different systems and begin to interweave them. And obviously we have a lot of training around how to help you do that, but you're ultimately the one that has to take charge of that and say, I see where I'm at in this model, I see where I'm at in this model, and this is who I am as an individual, this is how I'm going to grow, this is how I'm identifying. And it's really custom to you. And as we're talking, it became clear the first thing we've already talked about at the beginning is, oh, you can't box me in, I'm so unique and individual. You are. Mm-hmm. And that's why you, as a listener, are it's great, because as you learn this, you're going to be able to take some of these models and begin to integrate them in your life, understand more about yourself, and really weave them together, because no one else can do that like you can. Just like my grandmother can't, she's got to be responsible for her own health. No doctor can be completely responsible for her health like she can. And so that's kind of a metaphor. As you're talking, I'm seeing this parallel here. This is what you as a listener need to be doing. This is what all of us need to be doing in our lives, is taking these models and using them in how we can use them as tools.
Well, and that might sound like a hyperbolic analogy, because, we're talking about her health, right? Her physical health and whether or not she could potentially die. And yet, when it comes to our emotional health, that's the major component to why these typologies are so useful. Our emotional health is what that informs so much. The book Emotional Intelligence by Daniel Goldman, he really, breaks down on a pretty granular level and with some quite persuasive language that our emotional intelligence is going to influence every component of our life. Like our ability to be happy individuals, our ability to be happy is based on our emotional intelligence. And a major component to why typologies are so useful is that they help bring our emotional intelligence up, right? They help us understand who we are on a psychological and emotional level. And while that might not necessarily be our, it might not kill us to not know these models. In fact, it won't kill us to know these models, in general. It is going to impact the quality of life that we lead. And that's one of the reasons why I think you and I are so focused on not just personality typologies as an interest, right? Like, because, there's a huge swath of people out there that just like typologies, right? Like, they just are interested in them. I think you and I are very focused on personality development, using these typologies to increase our individual happiness, using them to increase our understanding of where we're at in the span of our entire life and how it's going to help us get to the next level. How can we use these models to develop and grow as individual human beings? And when it comes to that, I don't think that that's a hyperbolic analogy. I think that our happiness life, right? Like our being able to raise our happiness thermostat up. I think that is, it can be very influenced by understanding this material. And I had a friend say about another type of tool that, when it comes to growth and development, you can either walk across the United States or you can take a jet. And that's how I see these models too. I think all of the information that's found in a lot of these models in typology systems, they're not absolutely imperative or necessary, right? You can do the same thing using other tools. I do think, though, that having a clear understanding of where you fall on a lot of these models, both horizontal and vertical, I think it just makes things faster. It just supercharges things and makes it go much, much faster to get to the next level.
Yeah.
So I think that that's a major component of why they're important. The two things, though, that I want to, it's really one thing that I want to mention before we end this podcast, before we launch into the podcast on the individual models, is there's something that a mentor of mine said that I think is really important, and that is, don't believe anything too much. These are tools. They're not meant to be there's not enough hubris here to say that they are reality.
Yeah.
Right? Like, these are just maps and models. Alfred Korzybski, the very famous systems thinker, said the map is not the territory, meaning that these maps are not pretending to be the person. Right? Yeah. When you understand where somebody falls in a typology system, that's not meant to indicate that you now understand the person in entirety. So just kind of remember that. Take all of it with just a grain of salt. They're meant to be useful. They're meant to help you understand yourself better. And they're meant to be a guide, right? Like, a map is a guide to territory, but the map will never actually be the territory. So even when it comes to yourself, even if you really identify strongly with a typology, right? Like, you're like, oh, I'm totally fill in the blank, right? Whichever typology you're using. Even if you massively identify with it and you feel like it's really useful to know that, just remember, it's not a complete picture. It's not the reality of who you are. It's not the reality of your personality. And you're more than that. You're more than the typology itself.
Yeah. I agree, and I think that as you begin to study and unpack your personality and all the different variations of it, it gets exciting because you can, like Antonia said earlier, it gives you permission to become the best version of yourself. And you can begin to see, oh man, there is so much potential. I'm an awesome human being. I'm an awesome person. I'm excited to be who I am. I'm not flawed. I'm not broken. I'm okay exactly as I am, and I'm excited to see where I'm going to be going next. Is a powerful, powerful way to see the world.
Yeah, absolutely. So those might feel like contradictory, statements. The whole thing that they're really, like, we feel that maps and models are so helpful and that you're responsible for knowing where you're at and your growth and your development and the flying a jet over the United States as opposed to walking, and also take it with a grain of salt. But that's all things that are useful. All things that are useful are not going to be complete.
Yeah.
So just remember that when we over attach to these things, we get ourselves in trouble. And when we completely disregard them and see them as meaningless, we can not get ourselves in trouble, but maybe retard our growth a little bit. Absolutely. So the truth falls somewhere in between.
So what are your thoughts? What do you have to say about this? Questions, thoughts, comments? You can find us over at personalityhacker.com or facebook.com/personalityhacker, twitter.com/personalityhack. And we'd love to have you engage with us and be part of the Personality Hacker community, the growing community of people that are of like minds, that are wanting to grow and develop themselves. So come over and say hi to us. I want to see who you are. So my name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
We're going to talk to you on the next Personality Hacker podcast.